my next question, actually, because from my perspective, you know, in talking to my students and other people, we, and I include myself in the we, often miss this, the ethics of your work, the challenge to the nature culture divide, and this misunderstanding often causes some of us to group your work into the nature school movement, or helping children to become stewards, you know, or the saviors of us by learning how to be better keepers of the world. Can you talk a little bit about this confusion?
Yeah, well, I think that confusion comes from the fact that we're trying to make a distinction between, you know, what we're referring to as a common world, and that world is a natural cultural mix, and it's an imperfect world. It's a damaged world. You know, in your case, in you know, in the lands that are now called Canada, and in Mindy, in my case, in the lands that are now called Australia, these are very highly damaged, settler colonized places, lands and peoples. And, you know, they're not gorgeous. It's not like pure nature that exists in some sort of fantastical, you know, Disney-like kind of notion. It's these aren't gorgeous worlds. There's lots of things that are fabulous about them, but there's nothing pure about it. And they're not the sort of, they're not, these commonwealths aren't the sort of nature that people think about when they talk about nature, as of the nature culture divide. I mean, think about Richard Louv's work. He, you know, his work on, you know, returning children to nature and the whole returning children to nature movement. It's very much based on that, exactly that, on a very romantic notion of nature as being sort of pure and salvic, really, like a place to go in order to recover from, you know, the kind of corrupting influences of society. I mean, that's just kind of pure Rousseau. So it goes, you know, it's just a sort of an extension of a very, very specific white, middle class, masculine notion of what nature is. And most people in the world don't actually share that notion. It's very specific, it's very culturally specific. But the tricky thing about nature is, because it is, people talk about nature as if it's self-evident, because it just is. And the word nature is, you know, then extended into the kind of adjective of natural, and that's always used to justify that things are just like that. It's just how it is. But actually, it's a very, very cultural concept. So even the word nature is cultural. That's the kind of irony of it all. There's nothing pure and self-evident about it. So, you know, really what we're trying to do when we're shifting across to using common worlds is to sort of point out that children live, grow up and learn in an entangled world of natures and cultures that are both material and semiotic. They're messy, they're imperfect, they're full of all sorts of, you know, inheritances, imperfections, tensions, problems, legacies. And, you know, clearly because of the time that we're living in and the awareness that we're now having around the anthropogenic, ecological problems that we've caused through our actions, that also come from this idea that we're separate from nature and we can sort of act on it with impunity. We're not. We're part of a world, an inseparable part of a world. So I guess the whole thing about the nature school movement, it only makes sense if you're thinking within the logics of a nature culture divide, and that's actually what we're trying to sidestep. So it's not the same thing. Yeah, that'll do.
I'll just add a little bit following up on what Affrica was noting about the nature culture divide, and your question, Kathleen, about nature schools and other stewardship approaches. One of the differences, and I don't want to create a binary, but one of the differences between some of this work on nature kindergarten and nature preschools and so on and so forth is that there is an ideal answer in a lot of these programs, and that ideal is, let's bring children to nature and everything is going to be okay. But in our work is about being open to thinking together with children, with educators, and also with the more than human, about creating other worlds in the midst of this devastation that Affrica was talking about. So this masculinist idea that we know how to fix the world, that is embedded within the nature programs, I think it's quite a dangerous idea. You know, I have a lot of questions about it. Like, what if accessing this nature that we bring children to is not even an option? What if getting rid of all of the toxic waste is actually an impossibility? Like we are seeing that right now, right? And what to do in the midst of this colonial extractivist logics that we are breathing every day, right? Perhaps it's not even up to us to fix.
Yeah.
That's a
And
really
I think the point is,
question. That's, yeah.
Yeah, I think the point is there's no outside. And I think that the nature movement, the returning children to nature movement, believes there is an outside, that you literally take the children outside into nature and that everything gets better because nature cures and fixes everything. But there is no outside. There is no kind of pure nature there to go into. There's nature and culture in the classroom. There's nature and culture outside of the classroom. They're always mixed together. They don't separate out. And there just is no outside. So you've got to, then the challenge is, okay, how do you learn how to make the best of what we've got and the legacies that we inherit? Not just us humans, but everybody, all beings inherit. And I've written a bit about challenging the stewardship model, and that was quite hard to do because, you know, I think people have really, really good intentions and really care about the state of the world and what we can do about it. And in educating young children particularly, you know, most early childhood educators are well aware that, you know, we're bequeathing them a pretty messed up world and it's not great. So I think when we start to think about, you know, allowing kids, you know, to have these pure nature experiences so they develop an affinity for nature so they can grow up being stewards, it's incredibly well-meaning, but it's also kind of bit misguided because it's a fantasy that this pure world that they have this affinity with is going to kind of miraculously kind of resolve and they're going to be out there with it, protecting it. It's a fantasy. So I think it also comes from a problem that we have in the West, where we separate ourselves off from the rest of the world as if we're not, you know, a part of it. Because we can only be a steward of something in the Western sense of stewardship if you see yourself as separate from and in a sort of sense kind of superior to. Like, we've got all the answers, we'll find the answers, science will find the answers, and then we'll, you know, we'll fix it. So it's a very, you know, the whole idea of kind of managing the environment, being a steward of the environment in the Western sense, which is completely different to an Indigenous sense of custodianship, which is actually kinship based, and it's reciprocal. It's about responsibility and exchange and mutual obligation. This isn't about this. This stewardship model we talk about in the West is we look after nature and make sure it's okay, because we're the good guys, not the bad guys that wrecked it. So, you know, there's this whole sort of strange sort of ways of dissociation that go on in the stewardship model that aren't often recognized, because it does sound good and it does feel good to feel like, you know, you really care and you want to do something about it. So you're going to become a steward and you'll help children become a steward. But fundamentally, it's kind of flawed, There are other models, and I think what we're trying to do is get at something else that's not so based on a separation, but based on a collaboration with the world.
And I think what makes that so tricky in early childhood education is that when you think about the field of early childhood education, it is based on finding an ideal answer, and it is about managing and controlling. So I think that's what makes it really, really tricky. And so, you know, the work that we've been doing from way back, we were always seeing and saying that it does require a paradigm shift. And so what does it mean to do that paradigm shift? But first, you've got to realize that you're situated within this system that is all, you know, in all these subtle and not so subtle ways about managing, controlling, finding an answer. And so working against that is so tricky. So it's not a surprise that often the work that we've been doing gets equated to nature schools. And, you know, I think that it makes sense of why that happens.
And as I listen to you, three of you too, I think what will help me to challenge myself not to get drawn into this nature movement, not to say that I disagree with it or what, but just that not that I get caught up in these ideas, is this idea of intention, values, and belief. What was the purpose of the common worlds? It isn't to take children outside and cleanse them, sort of by dropping them into a clean pond of water or rolling them around on cream glass. It's about an ethical way of being in a world as it exists, the messiness, the damaged, and then how do we together live well, which is a very different question. So I think that that's really helped us, at least helped me to think about why we always go back to our intentions and our beliefs. What is it that we're trying to do? What do we stand for? And standing with our people, as you said, Mindy,